Have you ever watched someone destroy their entire life in less than 60 seconds? Because that's exactly how long it took Blake Morrison
This is
to
a
go from
nice
corporate
flight.
royalty
It
to
is
absolute
so peaceful.
zero.
Look at
The
that
scene
view.
plays out like a nightmare in reverse.
Give me that! Get away
San
from me!
Francisco International
Ow!
Airport
Ow!
Gate,
Let
82
go! Hey!
Terminal
What's
3.
going on?
A man in a navy pinstripe suit stands frozen as 3 airport police officers flank him, their badges catching the fluorescent light. Behind them, a crowd of passengers pulls out phones recording lights blinking red like predators smelling blood. The man's face has drained of all color, his expensive Tom Ford suit suddenly looking like a costume 2 sizes too big for his shrinking frame. A uniformed station manager steps forward, clipboard raised like a weapon, and speaks words that will echo in every business school case study for the next decade. Your employment with Skyward Airlines is terminated with cause. But that's not where this story begins. That's where it ends. Or rather, where Blake Morrison ends. The real beginning happens 12 hours earlier, 6 time zones east, in the humming heart of Manhattan, before the sun has even considered rising. Marcus Hayden's private office occupied the 42nd floor of a Tribeca tower that had been a textile warehouse in another century. The exposed brick and steel beams gave the space an industrial edge that stood in deliberate contrast to the sleek technology humming on every surface. Triple monitors displayed real-time logistics data from shipping routes spanning 3 continents. A satellite phone sat beside a battered Panasonic Toughbook laptop, the kind of military-grade encryption device that looked like it had survived a war zone, which, in a sense, it had. Marcus stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the city wake up beneath a sky still clinging to darkness. He wore a charcoal gray cashmere hoodie that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, though you'd never know it from looking at him. The fabric had that broken-in softness that came from years of wear. His joggers were similarly unremarkable, paired with Nike prototype sneakers that wouldn't hit retail shelves for another 18 months. No watch, no jewelry, no visible signals of the 9-figure fortune attached to his name. The laptop screen behind him cast a blue glow across the contract documents spread on the glass desk. $2.4 billion in financing structured across 3 tranches designed to pull Skyward Airlines back from the edge of insolvency. Marcus had spent 6 months quietly acquiring 51% of the company's voting shares through a network of shell corporations so carefully layered that even the SEC auditors would need a roadmap and a prayer to trace the ownership chain. The brilliant part wasn't the acquisition. The brilliant part was that nobody knew. His phone buzzed. Vincent Graham. Right on schedule. Marcus morning. The voice on the other end carried the careful optimism of a man who'd spent too many nights wondering if his company would survive until breakfast. Flight confirmed for today. Seat 1A, JFK to San Francisco. Marcus's voice had that particular quality of controlled calm, the kind that made people lean in to hear him rather than forcing them to listen. I'll be at your Palo Alto office by 11 Pacific tomorrow. We'll sign the papers, wire the first tranche, and your fuel suppliers can start breathing again. You're a godsend, Marcus. You know that 12,000 jobs? 12,000 families. I'm just a businessman, Vincent. See you tomorrow. He ended the call before the chairman could spiral into gratitude. Marcus had learned early that excessive thanks made people uncomfortable with their own desperation. Better to keep it transactional, clean. He returned to the laptop, fingers moving across the keyboard with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd built an empire 1 line of code at a time. Titan Core infrastructure had started 15 years ago in a basement apartment in Brooklyn with nothing but the idea and a military logistics background that Marcus never talked about. Now the company quietly moved 40% of domestic freight across the United States, the invisible circulatory system keeping the economy's heart beating. Warehouses in Memphis, distribution hubs in Dallas, container yards in Long Beach. Most people had never heard the name Titan Core, which was exactly how Marcus preferred it. The philosophy had been drilled into him by his first mentor, a retired Texas oil magnate named John Patterson, who'd taken a chance on a 23-year-old veteran with more ambition than capital. Patterson's favorite saying had been carved into a wooden plaque that still hung in Marcus's office: "Wealth whispers. Insecurity screams. The moment you needed people to know you were powerful, you'd already lost the only power that mattered. Marcus closed the laptop and slipped it into a weathered leather backpack that had seen better decades. His assistant had confirmed the car would arrive in 20 minutes. Plenty of time. He pulled out his phone one more time, scrolling through the Skyward Airlines mobile app. Seat 1A, bulkhead window. 6 hours of uninterrupted focus to review the final contract language before tomorrow's signing. Perfect. He had no idea that Seat 1A would become the most expensive piece of real estate in his life. Across town, in a penthouse apartment that commanded views of Central Park from floor-to-ceiling windows that cost more than most houses, Blake Morrison was having a very different kind of morning. The closet in the master suite was larger than most New York studio apartments, with custom-built shelving displaying suits organized by color and season. Blake stood before the mirror, adjusting the lapels of his navy pinstripe Tom Ford suit with the kind of meticulous attention that suggested the fabric mattered more than the man wearing it. His Hamilton khaki field watch caught the light as he smoothed his slicked-back hair one final time. 45 years old, Senior Vice President of Customer Excellence for Skyward Airlines, and absolutely convinced that the universe had arranged itself specifically to serve his trajectory. The phone pressed to his ear carried his wife's voice, cold and sharp as January wind off the Hudson. "This golf weekend will close the Silicon Valley investors." Blake's tone carried that particular blend of defensiveness and bravado that men use when they're trying to convince themselves as much as anyone else. "My Q3 numbers are shit, Lauren. I need this." "Your numbers are always shit lately, Blake." Lauren Morrison's voice could have etched glass. "Maybe you should focus on actual work instead of networking." The word networking landed with the weight of an accusation. Blake's jaw tightened. She knew. Of course she knew. 28 years of marriage had given her a finely tuned radar for his particular brand of corporate embezzlement. The golf retreat at Pebble Beach was being expensed as a site inspection, the kind of creative accounting that would make the auditors raise eyebrows if they ever bothered to look. Which they wouldn't, because Blake Morrison was a senior vice president, and senior vice presidents didn't get audited for weekend trips. "I'll call you from San Francisco." He hung up before she could sharpen the knife further. The truth was gnawing at him in a way that expensive scotch and designer suits couldn't quite mask. The quarterly review was 2 weeks away, and the numbers told a story that Blake's ego refused to accept. Revenue down 18% in his division. Customer satisfaction scores the lowest in the entire company. And worst of all, CEO Patricia Vance had started making those particular kinds of comments that preceded executive bloodletting. "We're looking at restructuring, Blake. Prove your value, or we'll find someone who can." The Pebble Beach trip wasn't just about golf. It was about landing a commitment from Chen Technologies, a Silicon Valley AI firm whose CEO happened to be an avid golfer and a potential investor in Skyward's planned tech modernization. If Blake could close the deal, could walk into that quarterly review with a signed letter of intent from a billionaire tech founder, then maybe Patricia would remember why she'd promoted him in the first place. Maybe the board would forget about the 18% revenue drop and the customer satisfaction nightmare and focus on Blake Morrison Rainmaker, the man who could still bring in the whales. He checked his reflection one more time. The suit was perfect. The watch was perfect. The image was perfect. And that's what mattered in corporate America, wasn't it? The image. The performance. The ability to look like you belonged at the table even when the numbers suggested you should be cleaning up underneath it. Blake hadn't always been this way. The thought arrived unbidden as he packed his leather carry-on, and he shoved it down just as quickly. But the memory persisted anyway, stubborn as a stain. 10 years ago, he'd been a hard-working manager at the Chicago O'Hare hub, promoted on merit, respected by his team, genuinely good at his job. Somewhere between Chicago and the executive suite in New York, something had curdled. The promotions had come faster than his competence could keep pace. The title had started writing checks his abilities couldn't cash, and he'd learned that in corporate America you could fake competence a lot longer than you could fake connections. The turning point had been 3 years ago. Carlos Rivera, a junior analyst from Queens, had challenged one of Blake's decisions in a meeting. Not aggressively, not disrespectfully, Just a simple question about data methodology that happened to expose a gap in Blake's analysis. Blake had fired him the next day for insubordination. Rivera had sued for discrimination. The case had settled out of court buried under a non-disclosure agreement and a company check. And Blake had been promoted anyway because the board valued executives who could make problems disappear more than executives who avoided creating them in the first place. He'd learned the lesson well. Power protects power. Just look the part and play the game. Blake opened the Skyward Airlines app on his phone, pulling up his reservation. Flight 0447 JFK to San Francisco, departing at 9:45 a.m. He'd specifically requested seat 1A when booking last week. Bulkhead window, the only first-class seat with an extra 3 inches of legroom for the recline function. His back had been bothering him lately. Stress-related tension that his doctor had suggested might improve if he, quote, examined his relationship with workplace cortisol levels. Blake's solution had been to demand more comfortable airplane seats. The screen showed him assigned to 1D, across the aisle from 1A but not in it. His thumb jabbed at the seat map. 1A showed as occupied. Some other passenger had checked in, first claimed the seat Blake considered rightfully his by virtue of title and tenure. Irritation flared hot in his chest. He dialed the Skyward VIP Services line. "This is Blake Morrison, Senior Vice President of Customer Excellence." The words came out with the practiced authority of someone who'd spent years wielding his title like a club. "I'm on Flight 0447 this morning and there's been an error with my seat assignment. I requested 1A. I need it corrected immediately." The agent's voice carried apologetic professionalism. "I'm very sorry, Mr. Morrison, but seat 1A was assigned to a revenue passenger who checked in online yesterday evening. Full fare ticket. You're confirmed in 1D, which is also a premier bulkhead seat with, I don't care what the system says, override it. Sir, I'm not able to reassign a confirmed seat without the passenger's consent and then get their consent." "Mr. Morrison, the passenger is already checked in. They may already be at the airport. I really can't." Blake's voice dropped to that particular register of controlled menace that he'd perfected over years of getting his way. "Let me be very clear. I am a senior vice president of this airline. I have a medical condition requiring specific seating accommodations. If you cannot resolve this, I'll be documenting this call and forwarding it to your supervisor with a notation that you refuse to accommodate an executive's disability-related request. Do you understand the ADA implications of that decision?" The silence on the other end stretched just long enough for Blake to know he'd won. "I'll make a note in the system, Mr. Morrison. I'm very sorry for the inconvenience." "See that you do." He hung up before she could grovel further. The threat had been complete bullshit, of course. He didn't have a disability and the ADA didn't apply to personal convenience. But corporate drones scared easily when you invoked legal frameworks they didn't fully understand. Blake finished packing his bag, throwing in a golf shirt and designer sunglasses for the Pebble Beach weekend. His phone buzzed with his stock portfolio alert, the daily notification he'd set up to track his net worth. Skyward Airlines stock $52.30 per share. His unvested options package $4.8 million at current valuation. 2 more years until full vesting. 2 more years of playing the game, maintaining the image, closing the deals. Then he could cash out, leave this dying airline to implode without him, and retire somewhere warm where nobody would ask him to prove his value in quarterly reviews. He smiled at his reflection one last time. The game was almost over. He just had to hold on a little longer. In 2 hours, those options would be worth less than a cup of coffee. The Skyward Airlines first-class lounge at JFK Terminal 4 was designed to radiate exclusivity through carefully curated aesthetics. Leather club chairs, subdued lighting, a self-service bar stocked with premium liquor that passengers could pour themselves while pretending they weren't silently calculating the value of each drink against the lounge access fee. The windows overlooked the tarmac where aircraft lined up like enormous metal birds waiting for permission to hunt. Marcus Hayden entered the lounge at 8:45 a.m. His backpack slung over one shoulder, moving with the kind of quiet efficiency that made people's eyes slide past him. He nodded to the reception desk attendant, showed his boarding pass, and made his way to a corner table far from the main seating area. The laptop came out first, then the satellite phone, creating a small command center that looked unremarkable to anyone not paying attention. He was paying attention to the wrong things, though. The contract language, the stock positions, the carefully orchestrated financial rescue of an airline that didn't know he already owned it. What he wasn't paying attention to was the storm approaching from the elevator bank. Blake Morrison entered the lounge 20 minutes later like a man who expected trumpets. "Why isn't my latte ready?" His voice carried across the space loud enough to shatter the carefully maintained atmosphere of quiet luxury. "I texted ahead 20 minutes ago." The lounge staff scrambled. A barista materialized with apologies and promises of immediate preparation. Blake waved them off with the impatience of someone convinced that other people's time existed solely to be wasted in his service. He scanned the lounge, taking inventory. Mostly business travelers, a few families who'd probably used miles to upgrade, nobody who registered as important. His eyes passed over Marcus without recognition or interest. Just some kid in a hoodie, probably an employee using a buddy pass or someone who'd gotten lucky with a mileage upgrade, not worth acknowledging. Blake settled into a chair near the window, pulled out his phone, and began what would become a recurring ritual, refreshing his brokerage app to watch his net worth climb. Boarding began at 9:15 a.m., Zone 1. Passengers first, the premium tier who'd paid full fare or accumulated enough status to earn the privilege of entering the aircraft before the masses. Marcus was among the first down the jet bridge. The Boeing 787 Dreamliner was Skyward's newest flagship, still carrying that manufactured new plane smell designed to suggest innovation and reliability. First class was configured with 8 seats in a 1-2-1 layout, each seat effectively a private pod with direct aisle access. Seat 1A occupied the bulkhead window position on the left side, the most coveted real estate on the aircraft. He stowed his backpack in the overhead compartment, keeping only the laptop and satellite phone. The seat was exactly as advertised, premium leather, full recline, enough privacy to work without interruption for 6 hours. Marcus settled in, opened the laptop, and pulled on his noise-canceling headphones. The contract documents filled his screen, dense paragraphs of legal language that needed final review before tomorrow's signing. The cabin around him filled slowly. An elderly couple took seats in row 2, Frank and Dorothy Henderson from Phoenix, traveling to visit their daughter in San Jose. They smiled at Marcus as they passed. He smiled back, then returned to his work. The piece lasted exactly 7 more minutes. Blake Morrison's voice reached the aircraft before Blake Morrison did. "Brenda, I don't care what the app says. The cabin better be perfect. I'm not flying 6 hours on a plane that smells like someone's lunch." He appeared in the forward galley like an expensive storm system, all sharp angles and aggressive energy. The Tom Ford suit caught the cabin lighting, broadcasting wealth and position. His carry-on was heavy leather, the kind that cost more than the average passenger's entire trip. He scanned first class with the assessing gaze of someone checking for defects. His eyes landed on Marcus. Seat 1A. The seat that was supposed to be Blake's seat, the seat he'd specifically requested, the seat that some nobody in a hoodie had somehow claimed first. Blake's jaw tightened. The irritation from the morning phone call came roaring back, amplified by ego and entitlement. He dropped his bag into the overhead bin above seat 1D with more force than necessary, then turned toward the galley where a flight attendant was completing pre-departure checks. Rachel Torres had been flying for Skyward Airlines for 2 years. She was 26, based out of JFK, sending half her paycheck to cover her mother's chemotherapy treatments at NYU Langone Health, while trying to keep current on the mortgage for a tiny apartment in Queens. She loved her job most days, loved the travel and the people, and the particular satisfaction of helping passengers feel taken care of during the small anxieties of air travel. She did not love Blake Morrison. Everyone at Skyward knew the hatchet. That's what the crew called him, though never to his face. Blake Morrison, Senior Vice President of Customer Excellence, the executive who'd made his reputation by firing flight attendants for minor uniform infractions and gate agents for customer complaints that weren't their fault. Rachel had heard stories. A flight attendant in Dallas terminated for having her name tag pinned 1 inch lower than regulation. A gate agent in Chicago fired for rebooking a passenger without explicitly asking the passenger if they wanted to be rebooked, which technically violated some obscure customer choice protocol that nobody had ever heard of until Blake weaponized it. The company newsletter had run his profile last month, cutting costs, raising standards. The photo showed Blake in his suit, arms crossed, that particular smile that men wear when they think intimidation equals leadership. Now he was snapping his fingers at her like she was a dog. "You, come here." Rachel's chest went tight. She smoothed her skirt, forced her face into professional neutrality, and approached. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Morrison. It's an honor to have you flying with—" "Save the script." Blake cut her off with a hand wave. "Why is there a passenger in my seat?" Rachel blinked, confused. She pulled out the manifest tablet, scanning the seat assignments. "Sir, you're booked in 1D. Seat 1A is assigned to—" She checked the name. "Mr. Hayden." Blake's voice dropped low, though not low enough to prevent Marcus from hearing every word through his noise-canceling headphones. "I don't care what the computer says. I have a bad back. I need the bulkhead recliner. I am the senior vice president of this airline. Do I need to explain the hierarchy to you? Move him." Rachel's hands started to shake. The manifest was clear. Marcus Hayden. Full fare business ticket. $12,000 checked in online yesterday. Seat selection confirmed. But Blake Morrison was standing in front of her with that look on his face, the look that said her job was balanced on the next words out of her mouth. "Sir, the flight is fully booked. If I move him, I'd have to downgrade him to business or economy class, and that requires— I don't care if you have to put him in the cargo hold." Blake's voice rose enough that several passengers turned to look. "Look at him." He gestured toward Marcus without bothering to lower his volume. "He's wearing a hoodie. He's obviously a mileage upgrader or an employee on a buddy pass. We don't prioritize freeloaders over executives. Get him out of 1A. Put him in— I don't know. Find a jump seat. Just get it done before I call your base manager and have you debadged before we take off." The threat landed like a slap. Rachel had a mortgage. She had a mother whose chemotherapy schedule was taped to the refrigerator in the Queen's apartment. She couldn't afford to lose this job. Her hands were shaking harder now, the tablet screen blurring as her eyes stung. The fear of Blake Morrison outweighed everything her training had taught her about passenger rights and proper protocol. "Yes, Mr. Morrison." The words came out barely above a whisper. She crossed the cabin toward seat 1A, her heart hammering against her ribs. Every step felt like walking toward a cliff edge. Marcus had been deep in a particularly dense section of the financing agreement when he felt the presence beside him. He paused mid-sentence, noting the change in cabin energy before he saw the source. He slid one headphone back just far enough to hear. "Mr. Hayden." Rachel's voice was trembling. Professional training fighting against genuine fear. Marcus turned to look at her fully, giving her his complete attention. His eyes were dark, intelligent, and patient in a way that somehow made her feel worse about what she was about to do. "Yes. I'm so sorry to disturb you, sir." Rachel glanced back toward Blake, who was standing in the aisle with his arms crossed, tapping one expensive shoe against the cabin floor. "But there's been an error with the seat assignments. I'm afraid I'm going to need to ask you to move." Marcus raised an eyebrow. The expression wasn't angry or defensive, just curious with an edge of something that might have been amusement if the situation weren't so clearly absurd. "An error. I checked in online yesterday. My boarding pass says 1A. I paid full fare." "I understand, sir." Sweat was forming at Rachel's hairline despite the cabin's careful climate control. But it seems there was a system glitch regarding first-class availability. This seat is actually reserved for a senior airline executive who requires it for operational reasons. Marcus followed her gaze to Blake. Blake didn't look away. He held Marcus's eyes with a smirk of pure condescension, then made a show of checking his watch. "Operational reasons." Marcus repeated the words with the kind of dry tone that suggested he could see through the lie, but hadn't decided yet whether to call it out. "You mean the man in the Tom Ford suit who wants extra legroom?" Rachel flinched. Her professionalism was cracking around the edges, desperation bleeding through. "Sir, please. Mr. Morrison is a very important figure at Skyward. We really need to accommodate him. I can find you a seat in business class. It's still very comfortable." Marcus closed his laptop with deliberate slowness. The soft click sounded like a gunshot in the suddenly quiet cabin. Several passengers were watching now, pretending to look at their phones while tracking the confrontation in peripheral vision. Let me get this straight. Marcus's voice had dropped an octave, becoming dangerously quiet in the way that made people lean in rather than back away. I paid $12,000 for this ticket. I selected this seat specifically because I have work to do and I require privacy. And you want to downgrade me without a refund, I assume, because your boss wants to sit by the window. It's not. Rachel's voice cracked. It's not like that. It's a protocol issue. Priority is given to executive staff during operational travel. It's company policy. I know the regulations of the FAA and the Department of Transportation regarding involuntary bumping. Marcus didn't raise his voice, but the authority in it was unmistakable, the kind of command presence that came from somewhere deeper than corporate hierarchy. You cannot move a revenue passenger for a non-revenue employee regardless of rank once they have boarded the aircraft. That is a federal violation. Section 250.5 of Title 14, Code of Federal Regulations. Would you like me to cite the relevant case law? Blake overheard this exchange. His face flushed that particular shade of red that men turn when their authority is questioned by someone they consider beneath them. He pushed past Rachel hard enough to make her stumble, looming over Marcus with the full weight of his corporate arrogance. Listen here, pal. Blake's voice carried the practiced menace of someone who'd spent years getting his way through intimidation. You might know how to read a Wikipedia page on airline law, but you don't know how the real world works. I run this fleet. This plane represents my company. You are a guest in my house. He leaned in closer, close enough that Marcus could smell the coffee on his breath. Now you can grab your little backpack and move to seat 12F back in business class, or I can have security drag you off this aircraft for being disruptive. Which one sounds better to you? The cabin had gone completely silent. Even the passengers in business class who couldn't see the confrontation had stopped their conversations, sensing the shift in atmosphere. Marcus looked up at Blake. He didn't blink. He didn't look intimidated or angry or particularly bothered. He looked, if anything, bored by the entire performance. I am not moving. The words came out simple and final. And I would advise you, Mr. Morrison, to sit in your assigned seat and let the crew do their job. You are creating a liability. Blake's face went from red to that violent shade of purple that suggests blood pressure numbers incompatible with long life. His ego, already inflated to the bursting point by years of unchecked corporate power, couldn't process the rejection. A nobody in a hoodie telling him about liability, telling him no. Disruptive passenger, Blake shouted, spinning toward Rachel. You heard him. He's refusing crew instructions. He's being aggressive. He threatened me. I did no such thing. Marcus's voice remained level. He threatened me. Blake was playing to an invisible audience now, performing outrage for people who weren't buying the show. Get the gate agent. Get the police. I want this man removed from this aircraft immediately. I am not flying with a security threat. Rachel looked like she was about to cry. Her career, her mother's medical bills, her entire life was balanced on a razor's edge, and Blake Morrison was jumping up and down on one end. Mr. Morrison, maybe we can— Do it! Blake screamed, actual spittle flying from his lips. Or you're fired right now, badge on the table gone. Rachel flinched as if he'd struck her. She looked at Marcus with eyes that begged for forgiveness, even as she reached for the intercom. Marcus sighed. He reached into his hoodie pocket slowly enough that there was no ambiguity about the motion. Blake actually flinched backward, perhaps thinking Marcus was reaching for a weapon, but Marcus only pulled out a sleek black smartphone. He tapped the screen once and the red recording indicator appeared. Then he looked directly at Blake Morrison, and for the first time something cold flickered behind his eyes. You've just made the most expensive mistake of your life. Blake laughed. It was a cruel barking sound, completely empty of humor. Oh, you're recording me? Go ahead, put it on Twitter. See if I care. I have a PR team that scrubs guys like you from the internet before breakfast. You're done, kid. You're absolutely done. He turned his back on Marcus with theatrical contempt and physically sat down in seat 1. Literally sitting on the armrest and hovering over Marcus in an attempt to crowd him out through sheer aggressive presence. Get the cops." Blake directed this at Rachel without looking at her, his eyes locked on Marcus like he was willing him to break. "Tell them we have a hostile male passenger in first class refusing to deplane. Use those exact words, hostile male passenger. Make sure dispatch understands there's a threat." Rachel ran to the galley. She could feel the eyes of the entire cabin on her back, judging her, knowing she was about to do something wrong, something that violated every principle of fairness and human decency she'd been raised with. But Blake Morrison's voice was in her head, the threat of termination drowning out everything else. Marcus didn't move. He didn't argue. He simply opened a new window on his laptop. He wasn't opening Twitter. He was opening the direct terminal to the New York Stock Exchange. His fingers began to type. Two Port Authority police officers squeezed down the narrow first-class aisle. 7 minutes later, their duty belts heavy with equipment that made them move carefully in the confined space. Officer Davis, a burly man with 20 years on the job and the weary eyes of someone who'd seen this exact situation play out 100 times, looked between the immaculate Blake Morrison and the calm figure of Marcus Hayden. "What seems to be the problem here?" Blake stepped forward immediately, positioning himself to block the officer's view of Marcus. He put on what he probably thought was a concerned executive face, all furrowed brow and troubled sincerity. "Officers, thank God you're here." Blake lowered his voice to a stage whisper that was still loud enough for the first 3 rows to hear clearly. "I'm Blake Morrison, Senior Vice President of Skyward Airlines. This passenger in 1A has been belligerent since he boarded. He refused to follow crew instructions regarding seat assignments. He became verbally abusive toward the flight attendant, and when I tried to intervene as a company representative, he made a threatening gesture toward me." Blake paused for effect, then added the killing detail. "He implied he would take me out." Rachel gasped from the galley. It was a complete fabrication, a malicious lie delivered with the confidence of someone who'd learned that authority figures rarely questioned men in expensive suits. She opened her mouth to speak to defend the quiet man in the hoodie who'd done nothing but refuse to be bullied. Blake shot her a look. It lasted less than a second, but the message was perfectly clear. Say one word and your career is over. Your mother's chemotherapy becomes your problem alone. That apartment in Queens gets foreclosed. Everything you've worked for disappears. Rachel's mouth snapped shut. Tears welled in her eyes as she looked at the floor. Officer Davis frowned. He'd been doing this job long enough to develop a finely tuned bullshit detector, and every instinct he had was telling him that Blake Morrison was selling a story with more holes than facts. But the legal reality was tricky. If an airline representative formally requested a passenger's removal for safety concerns, the police had to enforce it first and sort out the truth later. They couldn't risk a mid-air incident based on a judgment call at the gate. Sir Davis addressed Marcus with an apologetic tone that suggested he knew this was wrong but had to do it anyway. "Is this true?" Marcus hadn't moved during Blake's performance. He'd simply closed his laptop and placed it carefully into his bag. Now he stood, and despite being only 2 inches taller than Blake, he somehow seemed to fill more space. Not through aggression or intimidation, but through a kind of absolute self-possession that made everything around him feel smaller. "Officer," Marcus's voice was steady, clear, and utterly calm. "I have a valid boarding pass for this seat. I paid full fare. I did not threaten anyone. This man wants my seat because it has extra legroom, and he is using your authority to facilitate a personal upgrade. That is the sum total of what's happening here." "He's lying!" Blake's voice cracked with indignation. "See? He's contradicting an airline executive. That's insubordination on a federal aircraft. I want him removed now, or do I need to call the commissioner?" Davis sighed. He probably had the commissioner's number on speed dial from previous incidents just like this one. The law was clear, even if the morality wasn't. "Sir," Davis's tone was firm but not unkind, "the airline has the right to refuse transport. If Mr. Morrison here says you're off the flight, you're off the flight. We can sort this out at the gate, but right now I need you to grab your bag and come with us." Marcus looked at Blake for 3 long seconds. The air in the cabin felt charged with invisible lightning pressure building toward some breaking point that nobody could quite identify. Then Marcus nodded once. Very well. He picked up his backpack with the same measured calm he'd maintained throughout the entire confrontation. As he stepped into the aisle, he paused beside Rachel. She was staring at the floor, tears streaming down her face, her entire body shaking. Marcus leaned in just close enough that only she could hear. "Don't be sorry. You're just a pawn. The king falls today." Then he walked off the aircraft flanked by the two officers, his head high and his stride unhurried. Blake watched him go with a triumphant grin spreading across his face. He turned to address the cabin where several passengers were looking at him with expressions ranging from disgust to disbelief. "Sorry about the delay, folks." Blake clapped his hands together like a game show host. "Just keeping the skies safe. Safety is Skyward's #1 priority." He threw his heavy leather bag into the overhead compartment above seat 1A with the careless force of someone who'd just won a battle. Then he collapsed into the seat itself, stretching his legs out fully, luxuriating in the extra 3 inches of space that had been worth destroying another man's travel plans. "Rachel!" He barked the name loud enough to make her jump. "Get me a scotch, double neat, and tell the pilot to push back. We're burning daylight." The jet bridge retracted with a hydraulic hiss. The heavy aircraft door swung shut with a thud that sounded like finality. Blake Morrison leaned back in seat 1. A closed his eyes and felt like the king of the world. He had won. He always won. He had absolutely no idea that he'd just signed his own death warrant. Marcus Hayden stood at the gate podium in Terminal 4, watching through the floor-to-ceiling windows as the massive Boeing 787 pushed back from the gate. The ground crew guided it with practiced hand signals, and the aircraft's engines began their preliminary spin-up, that distinctive whine of turbines building toward takeoff power. The gate agents were clustered near their desk, whispering behind their hands and shooting glances in his direction. The Port Authority officers had let him go after confirming he wasn't actually a threat to anyone except possibly Blake Morrison's blood pressure. They'd given him a warning to contact customer service for a refund and suggested he file a complaint through proper channels. Marcus didn't want a refund. He wanted blood. He sat down in one of the uncomfortable molded plastic chairs in the gate waiting area, isolated from the handful of passengers waiting for the next departure. The airport Wi-Fi was predictably terrible, so he tethered his laptop to the encrypted satellite phone, creating a secure connection that bypassed the public network entirely. He logged into the Titan Core Infrastructure Secure portal with a series of biometric confirmations that would have impressed a Pentagon security specialist. The stock market dashboard loaded, displaying real-time data from exchanges around the world. Skyward Airlines, ticker symbol SKYW, was trading at $52.30 per share. The chart showed a steady, if unremarkable, trajectory, the kind of stability that suggested investor confidence in the upcoming financing deal. The market had no idea how fragile that confidence actually was. Marcus pulled up the detailed analysis. Skyward was leveraged to the absolute limit, carrying debt loads that would crush the company if the upcoming credit facility didn't close on schedule. The financing package Marcus had spent 6 months structuring was the only thing standing between Skyward Airlines and insolvency. Without that signature tomorrow morning at the Palo Alto office, the company's credit lines would freeze. They wouldn't be able to purchase fuel. Aircraft would be grounded. 12,000 employees would be out of work by the end of the week. And Marcus Hayden owned 51% of the voting shares. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he'd committed to memory years ago. It rang once. "Marcus?" Vincent Graham's voice carried the gravelly quality of a man in his late 60s who'd spent too many years absorbing corporate stress. "Everything all right? Flight tracking shows your plane just pushed back." "I'm not on it, Vincent." Marcus kept his voice level, almost casual. "I'm not coming to San Francisco." There was a pause. Then, "What?" "I was on the plane, Vincent. Seat 1A. But your senior vice president, Blake Morrison, decided he wanted my seat. He had me removed by police. He told them I was a security threat." The silence on the other end stretched long enough that Marcus wondered if the connection had dropped. Then Vincent's voice came back, smaller now, shocked into a whisper. "He did what? He kicked the majority shareholder and the sole financier of your debt off the plane so he could stretch his legs. Marcus was still watching the 787 through the window. It had completed its turn and was taxiing toward the runway carrying Blake Morrison toward what he thought was a victory. "I'm pulling the deal, Vincent." "No." The word came out strangled. "No, Marcus, please. This is a misunderstanding. I'll fire him. I'll fire him right now. I'll have him arrested when he lands. Please don't tank the company over one idiot." "It's not just one idiot, Vincent. It's the culture that allows him to exist. It's the system that protects men like Blake Morrison while people like Rachel Torres have to choose between their integrity and their mortgage payment." Marcus's voice hardened. "But I'm a reasonable man. I won't bankrupt the airline, yet." "What are you going to do?" Vincent's question came out like a prayer to a vengeful God. "I'm initiating a hostile sell-off of my current holdings, and I'm releasing a press statement via Titan Core Infrastructure in 5 minutes. The statement will indicate that Titan Core has identified significant ethical and leadership failures within Skyward executive management and is withdrawing all support pending restructuring." "Marcus, that will crash the stock." Vincent's voice was hollow. "It'll drop 60% in an hour. The margin calls alone will destroy half the executives who are paid in options. The ratings agencies will—" "I know." Marcus cut him off. "And since Mr. Morrison is compensated largely through unvested stock options tied to share price stability, he's about to become very poor very quickly. The margin calls on his personal portfolio should trigger default clauses on his mortgages. I'm told he has a house in the Hamptons and a condo in Miami, all leveraged against those options. Gone. You're going to destroy him. I'm going to teach him a lesson in economics. There's a difference." Marcus paused, watching the 787 reach the end of the taxiway and turn toward the active runway. "Do not warn him, Vincent. If you warn him, if you give him any opportunity to sell his positions or protect his assets, I will bankrupt the entire airline. I will pull every dollar of Titan Core support and let Skyward collapse into Chapter 7 liquidation. 12,000 jobs gone because you couldn't resist protecting a bully. Do we have an understanding?" "Yes." The word came out as a defeated whisper. "We have an understanding." "Good. Let him land in San Francisco to the ashes of his career. I'll be in touch about the restructuring terms." Marcus ended the call before Vincent could beg further. He turned back to his laptop and opened a blank document. His fingers moved across the keyboard with practiced efficiency, drafting the press release that would detonate Blake Morrison's life. Press release for immediate distribution. Titan Core Infrastructure withdraws $2. $4 billion financing proposal for Skyward Airlines, citing irreconcilable leadership failures. New York, NY, Titan Core Infrastructure. The nation's leading domestic logistics provider announces immediate withdrawal of its proposed credit facility for Skyward Airlines NYSESKYW, following identification of severe ethical and management failures within executive leadership. After careful review, Titan Core has determined that Skyward's current corporate culture and executive decision-making processes are fundamentally incompatible with Titan Core's values of integrity, respect, and operational excellence. Titan Core will explore alternative investment opportunities in the domestic aviation sector with partners who demonstrate consistent commitment to ethical leadership and stakeholder respect. Marcus read it through once, then twice. The language was deliberately vague, designed to trigger maximum panic without providing enough specifics for competitors or analysts to dismiss it as a simple business dispute. The market would fill in the gaps with speculation, and speculation always ran toward the worst possible interpretation. Outside the window, the 787's engines roared to full power. The aircraft began its takeoff roll, accelerating down runway 31L with the graceless speed of something too heavy to fly, managing to fly anyway. Marcus hovered his cursor over the Publish button. The press release would go simultaneously to every major financial news outlet, every analyst covering the airline sector, and directly to the trading desks at the major institutional investors. The algorithmic trading systems would pick it up within milliseconds, parsing the keywords withdraws financing and leadership failures, and immediately triggering sell orders. The 787 rotated nose lifting toward the sky. Landing gear retracted. The aircraft climbed into the morning light carrying Blake Morrison toward what he thought was a lucrative golf weekend in Pebble Beach. Marcus clicked Publish. The effect was instantaneous. On his second monitor, the SKYW stock ticker hiccuped. The steady green line showing price stability wavered. Then it dipped. Then it nosedived. $52.30. $50. 48. 45. 41. The algorithms were responding faster than human traders could process the news. Sell orders cascaded into the system, each one triggering more automated selling, creating a feedback loop of panic that would take hours to stabilize. Marcus picked up his phone and dialed his broker. Short skyward with everything available in the discretionary fund. Sir. The broker sounded confused. The stock is already in free fall. We're looking at a 50% drop in the next hour. If you're wrong about the bottom, I'm not wrong. Marcus was still watching the 787 disappear into a cloud bank 30,000 feet up and climbing. It's going to single digits before the day is over. Short it all. He hung up before the broker could argue further. On the screen, SKYW had dropped to $38. Investors were flooding the exits, trampling each other in their rush to dump shares before the price fell further. Marcus leaned back in the uncomfortable plastic chair and allowed himself a small, cold smile. Blake Morrison was somewhere over Pennsylvania right now, probably sipping that scotch he'd demanded, feeling like he'd won. He had no idea that in 90 seconds his entire world had turned to ash. The cabin of Skyward Flight 0447 hummed with the particular white noise of pressurized air at 30,000 feet. Blake Morrison settled deeper into seat 1A, the stolen throne that had cost him nothing except a few minutes of righteous indignation and one annoying confrontation with a kid who didn't know his place. The scotch arrived in a crystal tumbler, amber liquid catching the light from the window. Blake took a sip and felt the warmth spread through his chest, validation in liquid form. 30 minutes into the flight, the satellite Wi-Fi kicked in with a soft chime from the overhead system. Blake pulled out his phone, expecting the usual flood of emails. Status reports from his team, confirmations for the Pebble Beach arrangements, maybe a grateful note from Vincent Graham thanking him for maintaining standards on the flagship route. What he got instead made his hand freeze around the scotch glass. 47 missed calls, 89 text messages, 12 voicemail notifications, news alerts pinging in rapid succession like a machine gun. The first text was from his assistant Brenda, all caps and panic. WTF is happening. Stock is crashing. CEO wants you on phone now. Blake's stomach dropped. He set the scotch down with a hand that had started to shake and opened his brokerage app. The Charles Schwab interface loaded slowly over the satellite connection, the progress bar crawling across his screen like it was deliberately torturing him. The numbers appeared, red everywhere. Deep arterial red. SKYW $28.40 per share, down 46%. His portfolio value had been $4.8 million when he'd boarded 90 minutes ago. Now the screen showed $2.6 million. $2.2 million had evaporated while he was drinking scotch and congratulating himself on winning a seat assignment dispute. Blake's mouth went dry. His heart hammered against his ribs. This had to be a glitch. The app was wrong. The satellite connection was corrupted. There was no way the stock could drop that far that fast without some catastrophic event, and he would have heard about a catastrophic event. He was a senior vice president. People told him things. He jabbed at the refresh button with a finger that left a sweat mark on the screen. SKYW $24.15 per share. Down 54%. Portfolio value $2.2 million. The number kept getting worse. Blake's breath came in short gasps. He fumbled for his phone, nearly dropping it, and opened the news aggregator app. The headlines loaded one after another, each one a hammer blow. Bloomberg. Mystery investor pulls plug on Skyward Airlines. Stock in freefall. CNBC. Titan Core Infrastructure withdraws $2.4 billion financing deal. Cites leadership failures. Wall Street Journal. Skyward Airlines faces liquidity crisis as backer walks away. The words swam in front of Blake's eyes. Titan Core Infrastructure. That name meant nothing to him. Some investor he'd never heard of, some behind-the-scenes money man who'd apparently been propping up the entire company's credit structure. And now that investor had walked away citing leadership failures. Leadership failures. The phrase felt like an accusation, though Blake couldn't imagine how any of this had anything to do with him. He was customer excellence, not finance, not his department, not his problem. Except his portfolio was currently losing $100,000 every 3 minutes, so it was rapidly becoming his problem. The phone in his hand began to vibrate. Vincent Graham. Blake answered it so fast he nearly hit the speaker button by mistake. "Vincent, what's going on? The stock is—" Vincent Graham's voice came through the phone like ice water. "Shut up, Blake. You are going to listen very carefully because right now, the man you just kicked off that plane is currently dismembering this company piece by piece." Blake's brain stuttered, trying to process the sentence. What man? It was just some guy in a hoodie. A nobody. The silence that followed felt like the pause before an execution. That nobody was Marcus Hayden. Vincent's voice could have frozen nitrogen. "He owns 51% of this airline, and you just declared war on him." The phone slipped from Blake's fingers. It tumbled down onto the leather seat cushion. Vincent's voice, still coming through the speaker, distorted and distant. Blake stared at the seat back in front of him, his mind replaying the confrontation in the cabin. The calm voice, the legal knowledge, the encrypted laptop, the warning, "You've just made the most expensive mistake of your life." Oh God, no. I kicked the majority shareholder off the plane. Blake's voice came out as a whisper that he barely recognized as his own. He picked up the phone with trembling hands. Vincent was still talking, the words coming fast and harsh. "Do you have any idea what you've done? Marcus Hayden isn't just some investor. He built Titan core infrastructure from nothing. He controls 40% of domestic freight logistics in this country. He was flying to San Francisco to sign the financing deal that would have saved this company. And you arrogant idiot, you had him removed by police because you wanted his seat." Blake's vision was narrowing, tunnel vision closing in from the edges. I didn't know. How was I supposed to know he looked like what, Blake? Like someone who didn't deserve to be in first class, like someone beneath you. Vincent's voice cracked with fury. "You judged him by his hoodie and now we're all paying the price." The call ended abruptly. Blake stared at his phone screen, watching the stock ticker continue its death spiral in real time. $22. $20. 18. He opened Twitter with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. The trending topics loaded like a executioner's playlist. Number 1 hashtag Skyward Meltdown. Number 2 hashtag Boycott. Skyward. Number 3 hashtag Justice. For Hayden, number 4 hashtag Fire Blake Morrison, his own name. Trending. 4th in the United States. Blake clicked on his name with the same compulsion that makes people press on bruises to see if they still hurt. The top tweet had 14 million views and climbing. It was a video shaky camera work from someone in business class who'd recorded through the gap in the curtain divider. Blake pressed play and watched himself destroy his own life. The audio was crystal clear. His voice loud and imperious. "I don't care if you have to put him in the cargo hold. We don't prioritize freeloaders over executives. Get him out of 1A. The camera zoomed in on Marcus Hayden's face as the Port Authority officers led him away. Calm, dignified, not arguing or fighting, just accepting the injustice with the patience of someone who knew the reckoning would come later. Then the video cut back to Blake's smug declaration to the cabin. "Just keeping the skies safe." The comments section was a digital bloodbath. At MarketWatch, Blake Morrison, SVP of Skyward, kicks majority shareholder Marcus Hayden off plane, stock down 65%. This is what institutional arrogance looks like. At Justice Seeker 99, suit versus hoodie. He assumed Hayden was nobody. Classic classism. Bankrupt this guy. At FlySafe. Canceling my platinum membership effective immediately. Disgusting behavior. At Skyward Air, how do you employ someone like this? Blake's hands were shaking so badly he nearly dropped the phone again. He looked up to find Rachel Torres standing at the front of the aisle holding her tablet against her chest like a shield. She wasn't smiling. The fear that had been in her eyes 90 minutes ago had been replaced by something colder. Contempt, mixed with pity. She knew. Everyone knew. Blake lurched to his feet, his legs unsteady beneath him. "Rachel, I need to speak to the captain. I need to use the satellite phone in the cockpit. My cell service is—" Rachel took a deliberate step backward, maintaining distance. "I'm afraid that's not possible, Mr. Morrison. The cockpit is a sterile environment during flight. Captain's orders." "I am the senior vice president." Blake's voice came out too loud, cracking on the last word. "I give the orders. Tell the pilot to get me a line to New York immediately." Rachel's expression didn't change. "Mr. Morrison, please lower your voice. You're disturbing the other passengers." "Disturbing them?" Blake's laugh was high and hysterical. "I own this airline. I actually—" A voice from row 2 cut him off. Blake spun around to find a man in a sharp gray suit lowering his reading glasses with the expression of someone watching a particularly pathetic wildlife documentary. "I'm an analyst for Goldman Sachs." David Cho's voice carried the flat authority of someone who dealt in facts rather than feelings. "According to the latest ticker, Skyward is currently trading at $18.20 per share. The board just announced an emergency suspension of trading, so technically, Mr. Morrison, looking at your unvested options at current valuation, you own approximately 0% of anything meaningful." Cho returned to his laptop without waiting for a response. "Sit down, Blake. You're ruining the flight." The words hit like a physical blow. Blake collapsed back into seat 1A, the expensive leather suddenly feeling like a trap. He was caged in a metal tube 7 miles above the earth, flying at 600 miles per hour away from the disaster while simultaneously being unable to escape it. He pulled up his brokerage app one more time, the compulsion of someone picking at a wound. SkyW $14.80 per share, down 72%. Portfolio value $1.3 million. $3.5 million. Gone. Evaporated. Deleted from existence while he sat in a chair he'd fought so hard to claim. Blake's phone rang again. Jerry Steinberg, his personal attorney. Blake grabbed for it like a drowning man reaching for driftwood. "Jerry, Jesus Christ, Jerry, you have to stop the trading. This is market manipulation. Hayden is dumping shares to spite me. Get an injunction. Call the SEC." The connection was terrible heavy static from the satellite relay. Jerry's voice came through in broken fragments. "Blake, can barely, not just Hayden, whole street, Moody's downgraded, junk status, can't stop it, nobody can. My options. What about my stock options? Underwater, Blake, deep underwater, and there's something else." Jerry's voice cleared just enough for Blake to hear the resignation in it. "Wells Fargo called. Your margin account used Skyward stock as collateral. They're issuing a 24-hour margin call. You owe $4.2 million by 4 p.m. tomorrow, or they liquidate everything." Blake felt the cabin tilt, though he knew rationally that the aircraft was flying straight and level. What everything? The Hamptons house, the Miami condo, your Porsche. All of it was leveraged against the stock value, Blake. It's all collateral. They can't take the house. Lauren is at the house right now. Blake, listen to me. Jerry's voice carried the exhaustion of someone delivering bad news to a man who wouldn't accept it. "I just saw a video. TMZ. Did you really call the cops on Marcus Hayden?" The line went dead. Turbulence over the Rockies, or maybe the universe deciding Blake had heard enough truth for one phone call. Blake sat motionless, his phone still pressed to his ear even though nobody was on the other end anymore. The cabin around him had gone quiet. No crew members approached to offer service. The other first-class passengers had formed a silent wall of judgment, united in their collective ostracism of the man who'd kicked a paying customer off the plane for wanting extra legroom. Frank Henderson, the elderly passenger in row 2, caught Blake's eye for just a moment. The look of disappointment on the old man's face was somehow worse than outright anger. Frank shook his head slowly and returned to his book. Blake closed his eyes and tried to construct some version of reality where this could still be fixed. He'd get to San Francisco. He'd call the board members individually. He had leverage on half of them knew which ones had expense account irregularities, which ones had hired relatives into no-show positions. He could trade information for protection. That was how the game worked. Power protected power. But even as he thought it, Blake knew the game had changed. The rules he'd been playing by had just been rewritten by someone who owned more pieces on the board than Blake had ever imagined existed. He opened his eyes and checked the flight progress map on the seatback screen. 3 hours and 45 minutes to San Francisco. The distance felt infinite. It's out 30,000 feet below Blake Morrison's disintegrating world. Marcus Hayden sat in a glass-walled conference room at the Teterboro Airport private terminal in New Jersey. The room overlooked the tarmac where his Gulfstream G700 was being prepped for departure, fuel trucks attending to it like priests performing a ritual. On the massive screen mounted to the conference room wall, 12 faces stared back at him through a Zoom connection. The Skyward Airlines board of directors dialing in from their various bunkers across the country. Palo Alto, Dallas, Phoenix, Seattle, New York. Every one of them looked like they'd aged a decade in the past hour. Vincent Graham opened the emergency meeting with a voice that trembled despite his best efforts. Marcus, on behalf of the entire board, I want to formally apologize for this morning's incident. It was reprehensible, unacceptable. We've already drafted a statement condemning Blake Morrison's actions in the strongest possible terms. Marcus leaned back in his chair, completely relaxed, sipping Pellegrino from a crystal glass. He was still wearing the same charcoal hoodie from the plane. The juxtaposition between his casual appearance and the corporate power he was wielding seemed designed to make everyone on the call uncomfortable. An apology is nice, Vincent. Very thoughtful. Marcus's tone was pleasant, almost friendly. But the market doesn't trade on apologies. The market trades on confidence. And right now the world sees Skyward as a company where senior executives abuse passengers and make critical business decisions based on personal convenience. Why would I invest $2.4 billion into that? Sarah Fielding, calling in from the Dallas hub, leaned toward her camera with the desperation of someone watching their stock options turn to vapor. We'll make changes, Marcus. Immediate changes. We'll restructure the entire executive team. We'll implement new oversight protocols. Whatever you need. You'll certainly make changes. Marcus set down his water glass with precise care. But not because I'm asking nicely. You'll make changes because, as of 20 minutes ago, Titan Core Investments bought every share of Skyward stock available on the New York Stock Exchange during the crash you're all currently living through. He slid a document onto the shared screen. The faces on the Zoom call went pale as they read the acquisition summary. I also negotiated emergency block purchases from CalPERS pension fund and 2 New York hedge funds that were facing redemption calls. Combined with my existing position, Titan Core now controls 62% of Skyward Airlines voting shares. The silence on the call was absolute. Marcus watched realization dawn on each face in sequence. He hadn't just crashed the stock. He'd used the crash he'd engineered to buy control of the company at a 90% discount to yesterday's price. It was a hostile takeover disguised as a market panic, and every person on that call knew they'd just been outmaneuvered by someone playing chess while they'd been playing checkers. You orchestrated this, Sarah Fielding's voice was hollow. You crashed your own investment to take control. I rescued my investment from people who didn't deserve to manage it. Marcus's correction was gentle but firm. There's a meaningful difference. Richard Brennan, the CFO, calling in from Phoenix, tried to muster some corporate authority. You can't just buy the whole company and fire everyone. There are governance procedures, shareholder protections. I own 62% of the voting shares, Richard. I can do whatever the bylaws permit, and the bylaws permit quite a lot when you control a supermajority. Marcus pulled up another document. Here are my terms, non-negotiable. You can accept them, or I can force them through at the emergency shareholder meeting I'm calling for next week. He paused to let that sink in. Term 1. The financing deal proceeds as originally structured. $2.4 billion in credit facilities saving this airline from bankruptcy. The pilots keep flying. The flight attendants keep working. The mechanics keep the aircraft airworthy. 12,000 employees across 30 cities keep their jobs and their health insurance. They did nothing wrong. I will not punish innocent people for executive failures. Vincent Graham's relief was visible even through the pixelated video connection. Thank you, Marcus. That's incredibly generous. I'm not generous, Vincent. I'm practical. Those employees create the value this company needs to survive. Marcus's voice hardened. Which brings me to term 2. The current executive leadership team is dissolved effective immediately. Vincent, you'll stay on as honorary chairman for a 90-day transition period to maintain continuity. Everyone else on this call submits their resignation by midnight Eastern Time tonight, or I terminate you for cause tomorrow morning. Your choice. The protests erupted simultaneously. Sarah Fielding. You can't fire the entire board. Richard Brennan. This is unprecedented. Tom Whitmore from Seattle. We have contracts. Marcus waited for the noise to die down before continuing with the same measured calm. You created a corporate culture where a senior vice president felt comfortable having a paying passenger removed from an aircraft by police because that passenger wore a hoodie instead of a suit. You're not just complicit in Blake Morrison's behavior. You enabled it, you rewarded it. You promoted him despite a discrimination lawsuit 3 years ago that you settled quietly rather than addressing the root cause. He let that statement hang in the air for 3 seconds. So, yes, you're all fired. The new board will be announced within 72 hours. I'm bringing in executives from Southwest Alaska Airlines and JetBlue, people who understand that operational excellence and human dignity aren't mutually exclusive concepts. You can resign with severance packages, or I can terminate you for cause and you get nothing. Midnight tonight. Decide. Vincent Graham looked like he was watching his legacy crumble in real time. And Blake Morrison? What happens to him? Marcus leaned forward toward the camera, and for the first time since the call started, something cold flickered behind his eyes. Blake Morrison will be met at the gate in San Francisco by airport police. I've filed formal complaints with the FAA and FBI regarding false statements to federal law enforcement officers. He'll be detained for questioning the moment he steps off that aircraft. Marcus, that's extreme. The press is already having a field day, Vincent. We're not avoiding publicity. We're controlling the narrative. Marcus's voice could have cut steel. Blake Morrison's termination will be read to him in the terminal at San Francisco International Gate 82 in front of the passengers he delayed and the crew member he terrorized. He will be stripped of his corporate credentials, his corporate phone, and his corporate credit cards in full public view. Marcus paused. He wanted everyone to know he was important. He wanted to be the center of attention. I'm giving him exactly what he wanted, just not the kind of attention he was expecting. The board members looked at each other through their respective camera feeds, each one silently calculating whether they had any leverage left to negotiate. The answer was written on every face they didn't. It will be done. Vincent's voice came out barely above a whisper. Good. Marcus checked his watch. I have a plane to catch. The new interim CEO is Michael Torres, formerly COO of United Airlines. He'll be calling into this meeting in 15 minutes to outline his first 100 days. I suggest you all be prepared to answer his questions about how we got here. Marcus ended the Zoom call without waiting for responses. The screen went dark, leaving him alone in the conference room with the view of the tarmac and his waiting aircraft. His assistant, Chloe Chen, appeared in the doorway holding a tablet. Mr. Hayden, the Gulfstream is fueled and ready. Flight plan filed for San Francisco. We can depart in 20 minutes if you want to beat the commercial flight. How much time do we have? If we depart now, we land at SFO approximately 90 minutes before Flight 0447. Chloe consulted her tablet. Plenty of time for you to clear the FBO, get to the terminal, and be waiting when Blake Morrison walks off that plane. Marcus stood and picked up his backpack. Then let's not keep Mr. Morrison waiting. He's had a very stressful flight. The least I can do is be there to welcome him personally. Chloe followed him out of the conference room toward the tarmac access door. Sir, if you don't mind my asking, why are you flying to San Francisco just to watch him get fired? You could do all of this remotely. Marcus paused at the door and looked back at her with an expression that might have been a smile if it had contained any warmth. "I paid $12,000 for a first-class seat to San Francisco, Chloe. I intend to get my money's worth." Flight 0447 crossed into mountain time somewhere over Nebraska. Blake Morrison had stopped checking the stock price after it fell below $12. His portfolio had imploded to a value that barely covered the down payment he'd made on the Miami condo, and the rest was just mathematical variations on catastrophe. He'd tried calling the other board members. Richard Brennan sent him straight to voicemail. Sarah Fielding blocked his number. Tom Whitmore answered, listened to Blake's opening sentence, and then delivered a single line. "Vincent's orders are that nobody talks to you. Don't call me again." Click. Blake was alone at 35,000 feet with no allies and no strategy beyond an increasingly desperate hope that somehow this would all turn out to be a nightmare he'd wake up from. He tried the medical emergency gambit at hour 4 of the flight, approaching Rachel with his hand pressed to his chest and his face arranged in what he hoped looked like genuine distress. "Rachel, I'm having chest pains, sharp pains. I think it might be a heart attack." His voice came out breathless, which wasn't entirely acting given the panic attack that had been building in his chest since the stock crash. "We need to declare a medical emergency and divert to Denver." Rachel looked at him with an expression that suggested she knew exactly what game he was playing. "Sir, are you experiencing shortness of breath, pain radiating down your left arm, dizziness, or nausea?" "Yes, all of it. This is serious, Rachel. Tell the captain we need to land immediately." Rachel walked to the intercom and lifted the handset. Blake felt a small surge of hope. If he could get the plane on the ground in Denver, he could rent a car drive back to New York, bypass San Francisco entirely. He could disappear for a few days while he figured out how to salvage this disaster. The captain's voice came through the speaker loud enough for Blake to hear every word. "Ms. Torres, I've been instructed by Skyward Operations that Mr. Morrison is not authorized to request course diversions. If he's experiencing a genuine medical emergency, we'll arrange paramedics at San Francisco. Otherwise, we maintain current flight plan." "Clear." Rachel's eyes never left Blake's face. "Crystal clear, Captain." She hung up the handset. "The captain says medical staff will meet you at the gate in San Francisco, Mr. Morrison. Is there anything else I can get you?" Blake's last escape route had just been sealed. Marcus Hayden had thought of everything, reached into the system and locked every possible exit. Even the pilot was following orders that superseded Blake's authority. He stumbled back to seat 1A and collapsed into it. The leather that had felt like victory 6 hours ago now felt like a prison cell. He pulled out his phone one more time, the compulsion of someone who couldn't stop checking to see if the disaster was still real. SKYW $11.20 per share. Trading suspended pending news. Portfolio value $1.08 million. Nearly $4 million had vanished. His entire financial future had been deleted while he sat in a chair he'd stolen from the man who owned the company. Blake's phone buzzed with an incoming call. Lauren, his wife. He almost didn't answer, but some masochistic part of him needed to hear her voice, needed some connection to the life he'd had this morning before he'd destroyed it. "Lauren." His voice cracked on her name. "I know what happened, Blake." Lauren's voice was ice. "It's all over CNN, Fox Business, MSNBC. You kicked Marcus Hayden off a plane. I didn't know who he was. How was I supposed to—" "You weren't supposed to kick anyone off, Blake. What the hell is wrong with you?" She was shouting now, years of accumulated resentment finally finding an outlet. "Do you have any idea what you've done to us?" "Lauren, please, I need you to call Morgan Stanley. Tell them to liquidate the Vanguard accounts. We need cash to cover the margin call." Lauren's laugh was bitter and sharp as broken glass. "The margin call, Blake. Wells Fargo already called me an hour ago. They're foreclosing on the Hamptons house tomorrow morning. The papers are being filed today." Blake's vision grayed at the edges. "They can't do that without notice. There are legal procedures." "They can, and they are. And Blake, I'm not packing to move to the Manhattan apartment. I'm packing to go to my mother's in Greenwich. I'm done." "Lauren, wait." The line went dead. Blake sat motionless with the phone still pressed to his ear, listening to silence. 28 years of marriage. Gone. The Hamptons house with the ocean view and the garden Lauren had spent 5 years perfecting. Gone. The Miami condo where they'd planned to retire. Gone. His net worth. His career. His reputation. His freedom if the FBI complaint went anywhere. All of it gone because he'd wanted to sit by a window. The flight attendant chime sounded throughout the cabin. Rachel's voice came over the PA system with careful professional neutrality. Ladies and gentlemen, we've begun our initial descent into San Francisco. Current weather is clear temperature, 62 degrees. Flight attendants prepare cabin for arrival. Blake looked out the window at the California coast coming into view below. San Francisco Bay spread out like a map, the Golden Gate Bridge visible in the distance. Under any other circumstances, it would have been beautiful. Now, it looked like the gates of hell. The Gulfstream G700 touched down at San Francisco International 90 minutes before Flight 0447 was scheduled to arrive. Marcus Hayden collected his backpack and walked down the aircraft's stairs onto the private aviation ramp where a BMW sedan waited to transport him the 100 yards to the Atlantic Aviation FBO terminal. The FBO lounge looked like a 5-star hotel lobby had mated with a Silicon Valley startup office. Leather furniture, coffee bar with a barista, flat screens showing financial news with the sound muted. Marcus headed straight for the shower facilities, emerging 15 minutes later in a fresh hoodie identical to the one he'd been wearing on the commercial flight. He stopped at the Blue Bottle coffee counter and ordered a double espresso, then made his way through the connecting corridor that linked the private terminal to the public side of the airport. The walk took less than 5 minutes, and suddenly Marcus was standing in Terminal 3 among the civilian travelers completely invisible in his casual clothes and backpack. Gate 82 was in the far corner of the terminal, a Boeing 787 gate configured for international arrivals, but currently assigned to the domestic flight from JFK. Marcus found a structural pillar with a clear sightline to the gate area and settled in to wait, leaning against the concrete with his ankles crossed and his coffee in hand. The reception committee arrived 20 minutes later. 3 San Francisco airport police officers in uniform, their badges catching the fluorescent light. Mrs. Patricia Chen, the Skyward station manager for San Francisco, clutching her tablet like a weapon. A man in a suit who Marcus recognized as the process server he'd hired through a local law firm to deliver the civil lawsuit paperwork. They took up positions just outside the jet bridge door, creating a small arena cordoned off by belt barriers. Marcus checked his cheap Casio watch. 45 minutes until Flight 0447 landed. He sipped his espresso and waited. The minutes crawled past with the particular slowness of time before a reckoning. Marcus watched the gate area fill with passengers waiting for the next departure, oblivious to the theater about to unfold. A family with young children. Business travelers in various states of exhaustion. A couple holding hands and staring at their phones. Normal people living normal lives, unaware that in less than an hour, this gate would become the stage for the final act of Blake Morrison's destruction. Marcus's phone buzzed. A text from Vincent Graham. Michael Torres is already making changes. Board members are resigning. The bleeding has stopped. Thank you. Marcus didn't reply. The bleeding hadn't stopped. It had just moved to a different patient. Another text, this one from Chloe. Stock closed at $23.40, up from the low but still down 55% from open. Analysts are calling it a stabilization. You're being credited with saving the company. Marcus deleted both messages and put the phone away. He wasn't interested in credit or gratitude. He was interested in accountability. The airport PA system crackled to life. Skyward Flight 0447 from New York JFK is now on final approach to Gate 82, arrival in approximately 15 minutes. Marcus finished his espresso and dropped the cup in a nearby trash bin. He returned to his position against the pillar and waited. The aircraft appeared outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, massive and graceful despite its size. The 787 touched down on runway 28L with a puff of smoke from the tires, then began its taxi to the gate. Marcus watched it approach, tracking its progress across the tarmac until it lined up with the jet bridge. The engines spooled down. The ground crew chocked the wheels. The jet bridge extended with mechanical precision, connecting to the aircraft door with a soft thud that echoed through the terminal. Inside that plane, Blake Morrison was about to have the worst day of his life. Marcus checked his watch one more time, then looked up at the jet bridge door and waited for it to open. Inside the aircraft, Blake Morrison had unbuckled his seatbelt before the seatbelt sign had even turned off. He needed to be first off. This plane needed to control the narrative before the other passengers could upload their videos to social media once they got terminal Wi-Fi. He grabbed his leather bag from the overhead bin with enough force to make the compartment rattle. "Excuse me, coming through." He pushed past Frank Henderson without apology, nearly clipping the elderly man's shoulder with his bag. Rachel Torres was standing near the cockpit door as Blake approached. He expected her to step aside. She didn't. She stood her ground, forcing Blake to squeeze awkwardly past her in the narrow galley space, his expensive suit pressing against the counter. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second. Rachel's expression was completely neutral, but her voice when she spoke carried the weight of final judgment. "Goodbye, Mr. Morrison." It sounded like a curse. Blake pushed through into the jet bridge, his footsteps echoing on the metal flooring. The tunnel was cool and damp, San Francisco's marine layer creating condensation that made everything feel slightly unreal. He rehearsed his opening line to whatever VIP transport was waiting. "Get me a car to Pebble Beach immediately, and call ahead to the Ritz-Carlton." He burst through the jet bridge door into the terminal and stopped so abruptly that a passenger behind him nearly collided with his back. The area outside the gate had been cordoned off by belt barriers, creating a small, isolated arena. Inside that arena waited 3 San Francisco airport police officers, their uniforms crisp and their expressions professionally neutral. Next to them stood Mrs. Patricia Chen, the station manager, holding a clipboard. A man in a suit stood slightly apart holding a manila envelope, and leaning against a structural pillar 20 feet away sipping coffee and looking for all the world like he'd been there for hours, stood Marcus Hayden. Same charcoal hoodie, same worn sneakers, same backpack, same expression of absolute calm. Blake's brain refused to process the visual information. He looked back at the jet bridge, then forward at Marcus, then back again as if the physical impossibility of the situation would somehow resolve itself. "No." The word came out as a whisper. "That's impossible. I left you in New York. I saw you at the gate." Marcus checked his watch with exaggerated care. "Physics is a cruel mistress, isn't it, Blake? You flew commercial. Boeing 787 cruising at Mach 0. 85 with headwinds over the Rockies that probably added 20 minutes to your flight time." He gestured casually toward the windows overlooking the tarmac. "I flew private. Gulfstream G700 cruising at Mach 0.925 with Jetstream tailwinds over Nevada. I landed 90 minutes ago, cleared the FBO, had a shower, grabbed coffee from Blue Bottle, and still had time to make sure your reception committee was properly assembled." Blake's face had drained of all color. His hands were shaking badly enough that he had to set down his carry-on bag before he dropped it. "Chen." He turned to the station manager with the desperation of someone clinging to the last threads of authority. "What is this? This man is stalking me. He followed me across the country. I want him removed from this airport immediately, and get these police officers out of my way. I have a meeting at Pebble Beach." Mrs. Patricia Chen stepped forward. Her voice carried clearly across the cordoned area, loud enough for the gathering crowd of curious passengers to hear every word. "Mr. Morrison, I have just received a digitally signed directive from the Board of Directors in Atlanta. Effective immediately, your employment with Skyward Airlines is terminated with cause." The words hit Blake like a physical assault. The crowd of passengers behind him began to whisper. Phones came out. Recording lights blinked red. Blake laughed. The sound was high and hysterical, completely empty of humor. "Terminated. You can't fire me. I'm a senior vice president. I have a contract, a golden parachute clause worth $10 million. Marcus stepped away from the pillar and walked slowly toward the barrier. He stopped just inches from Blake, close enough to speak quietly but clearly. "You had a contract, Blake. Past tense. The cause for termination is gross misconduct, filing a false federal report with law enforcement officers and causing imminent reputational damage exceeding $400 million in market capitalization loss." Marcus's voice dropped even lower. "That voids your severance. It voids your stock options. It voids your pension with Fidelity. You get nothing." Blake spun in a circle looking for allies, for someone to validate that this couldn't be happening. He saw only strangers' faces, some sympathetic, most disgusted, all recording. "Who do you think you are?" The scream tore out of Blake's throat. "You're nobody, a fraud, a hacker in a hoodie." Marcus's voice became very quiet, very precise. "I am the owner. As of 2 p.m. New York time, Titan Core Infrastructure controls 62% of Skyward Airlines voting shares. This is my airline, Blake, my planes, my terminals from Boston to Seattle, my 12,000 employees, and you are trespassing." Blake looked at the police officers, his last hope for protection from whatever nightmare this had become. "Officers, you can't let him do this. This is harassment. I'm a U.S. citizen. I have rights." "Officer Williams." The lead officer shook his head slowly. "Mr. Morrison, we're not here for him. We're here for you." Williams pulled a notepad from his belt. "Blake Morrison, we've received a formal complaint from Titan Core Infrastructure and a request from the Federal Aviation Administration to detain you for questioning regarding an incident involving false statements made to law enforcement officers aboard a commercial aircraft. You're being held for questioning pending FAA and FBI investigation." Blake's knees buckled. He grabbed the belt barrier to keep from falling. "FBI, no, please, it was a misunderstanding. I just wanted the seat." The officers moved forward, flanking Blake on both sides. Their hands didn't go to handcuffs. He wasn't under arrest yet, just detained, but their presence was enough to make Blake's remaining dignity crumble. Mrs. Chen stepped forward again, tablet in hand. "Mr. Morrison, per company policy for terminated employees, I need to collect all corporate property immediately. Your security badge, your corporate phone, and your corporate American Express Platinum." Blake's hands fumbled in his suit pocket. He pulled out the badge first, the laminated card that had opened executive lounges and commanded respect from subordinates. It felt like cardboard in his trembling fingers. He handed it to Mrs. Chen, then his iPhone, then the heavy American Express card that had covered every meal, every flight, every hotel room for the past 5 years. "You're leaving me with nothing." Blake's voice broke. "How am I supposed to get home? My accounts are frozen." "You froze them!" Marcus walked right up to the barrier, so close that Blake could see his own reflection in Marcus's dark eyes. "You have a return ticket, Blake. I checked. Red Eye departing SFO at 11:55 p.m. tonight, arriving JFK at 8:10 a.m. tomorrow. But since you're no longer an employee or a VIP and your Wells Fargo credit is declined, your first-class return ticket has been voided." Marcus reached into his hoodie pocket and pulled out a printed boarding pass. He tucked it into Blake's suit jacket pocket with the delicate care of someone pinning a funeral boutonniere. "Economy class, middle seat, row 48, right next to the lavatory. The flight leaves in 11 hours. I suggest you find somewhere comfortable in the terminal to wait." Blake stared at Marcus with eyes that had gone hollow. "You ruined my life over a seat. You destroyed everything I had." Marcus shook his head slowly. "I didn't destroy you, Blake. You destroyed yourself the moment you decided your comfort was worth more than another man's dignity. You looked at me and saw a hoodie. You saw someone you could crush without consequences. You didn't ask who I was. You didn't consider that the kid in 1A might have built the infrastructure that moves 40% of America's freight." Marcus leaned in close enough that only Blake could hear the next words. "And just so you know, the margin call on your portfolio triggered a default clause on your mortgages. My real estate holding company bought the debt from Wells Fargo an hour ago. Titan Core Properties, LLC. We're foreclosing on the Hamptons house tomorrow morning. Your wife has already been notified. She's packing." Blake's eyes rolled back. His legs gave out completely. The two officers caught him under the arms, holding him upright as his expensive Italian shoes dragged uselessly against the linoleum floor. Marcus turned his back and walked away without another word. Behind him, the crowd of passengers erupted into applause. It started as a slow clap from somewhere in the back and built into a wave of approval that echoed through the terminal. "David Cho, The Goldman Sachs analyst who'd witnessed Blake's meltdown on the plane raised his voice above the noise. "Bravo!" Gate agents smiled. TSA personnel nodded. Even a janitor pushing a trash cart stopped to watch Blake Morrison being led away by police. His corporate credentials stripped his career, destroyed his life in ruins. Blake's last coherent thought before the officers guided him toward the airport police station was that 12 hours ago he'd been a senior vice president with a net worth of nearly $7 million. Now he was an unemployed man with a middle seat in economy, and 11 hours to contemplate exactly how a 60-second decision to steal someone's airplane seat had cost him absolutely everything. Rachel Torres stood in the jet bridge doorway watching Blake Morrison being escorted toward the airport police station. His shoulders slumped, his expensive suit suddenly looking like borrowed clothes on a broken man. The crowd's applause was still echoing through the terminal passengers, and staff united in their approval of justice served. She should have felt vindicated. Instead, she felt hollowed out like someone had scooped everything from her chest and left only the shell. Her hands were still shaking. They'd been shaking for 6 hours straight ever since Blake had screamed at her to move Marcus Hayden or lose her job. The fear had burrowed so deep into her nervous system that even now, watching Blake's public destruction, her body wouldn't release the tension. A voice spoke from just behind her left shoulder. "Ms. Torres." Rachel turned to find Marcus Hayden standing there, the backpack still slung over one shoulder, his expression softer than it had been moments ago when he'd delivered Blake's final humiliation. The hardness had drained away, replaced by something that looked almost like concern. "Mr. Hayden," Rachel's voice came out smaller than she intended. "I just wanted to apologize. I should have stopped him. I should have stood up for you back at JFK. I was just so afraid of losing my job, and my mom is doing chemo at NYU Langone, and I can't afford—" Marcus held up a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. "Courage is hard when your livelihood is hanging in the balance. I don't blame you, Rachel, but we're going to change the culture here. No more bullies, no more flight attendants forced to choose between their integrity and their mortgage payment." He reached into his hoodie pocket and pulled out a business card. The cardstock was thick, matte black with gold embossing that caught the light. Rachel took it with trembling fingers. Titan Core Infrastructure, Marcus Hayden, Chief Executive Officer. "I just spoke with the new interim CEO, Michael Torres. We're creating a position Associate Director of Crew Advocacy based at headquarters in Atlanta. We need someone who understands what it's like on the front lines. Someone who can build systems to ensure crew members never face what you face today." Rachel stared at the card, her vision blurring. "Me? But I've only been flying for 2 years. I'm based at JFK. I don't have any management experience." "Experience is measured in character, not years. You apologized to me even though you didn't have to. You were terrified of Blake Morrison, but you still treated me with basic human decency when he was demanding you dehumanize me." Marcus's voice was gentle but firm. "That tells me everything I need to know about who you are." He gestured to the phone number embossed on the card. "Call that number Monday morning. Interview at Skyward headquarters in Atlanta. If the board approves the position, and they will, you'll start in 6 months after training. We'll cover relocation from New York. Starting salary is $140,000 with full benefits." Rachel's knees went weak. $140,000, more than double what she made as a flight attendant. Enough to cover her mother's treatment without drowning in debt. Enough to breathe for the first time in 2 years. "I don't know what to say." Tears spilled down her cheeks, and she didn't bother wiping them away. "Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Hayden." Marcus nodded once. "You earned it. Now go file your trip report and get some rest at the crew hotel. You've had a day that nobody should have to experience." He turned to leave, then paused and looked back. "And Rachel, the next time someone like Blake Morrison tries to abuse their power, you'll have a direct line to report it without fear. That's what this position is for, so it never happens again." Rachel clutched the business card to her chest as Marcus disappeared into the terminal crowd, invisible again in his hoodie and jeans. She stood there for a long moment, processing the whiplash of the past 6 hours. Terror to humiliation to unemployment, anxiety to sudden opportunity. Her entire life trajectory had shifted because she'd been caught in the crossfire of two men, one who'd thought a title made him untouchable, and another who'd proven that power without character was just noise. She pulled out her phone and texted her mother. "Something happened today. Something big. I'll tell you everything when I get home. But Mom, I think everything's going to be okay." The response came back almost immediately. "Are you safe?" Rachel looked at the business card in her hand, then at the crowd of passengers still murmuring about the confrontation they'd witnessed. "Safer than I've been in a long time." The emergency board meeting reconvened at 1:30 Pacific time, which meant 4:30 Eastern, late enough that most of the board members looked like they'd aged another 5 years since the morning call. Marcus dialed in from the Atlantic Aviation FBO lounge, his laptop open on a sleek glass table, while his Gulfstream sat on the tarmac behind him, ready for the return flight to New York. Vincent Graham's face on the screen looked like a death mask. The chairman had spent the afternoon fielding calls from institutional investors, analysts, and journalists, all demanding to know how Skyward Airlines had imploded so spectacularly in a single trading day. His voice, when he spoke, carried the exhaustion of someone who'd been running damage control with inadequate tools. This session is called to order. As everyone knows, today's events have caused unprecedented damage to Skyward's market position and public reputation. However, Vincent paused, seeming to gather strength from somewhere deep. However, thanks to Mr. Hayden's intervention, we have avoided bankruptcy. The credit facility will proceed as planned. Contracts will be signed tomorrow at 11 a.m. Pacific at our Palo Alto office. The faces on the Zoom grid showed varying degrees of relief and resignation. They knew what was coming next. Sarah Fielding from Dallas spoke first, her voice flat. "I hereby submit my resignation from the board effective immediately." Richard Brennan followed. "I resign as well." Tom Whitmore. "Same here." One by one, 6 board members resigned in 90 seconds. The purge was surgical and absolute. Marcus watched without expression. These were the people who'd built the system that allowed Blake Morrison to terrorize employees with impunity. They'd settled discrimination lawsuits quietly, rather than fixing the culture that generated them. They'd promoted Blake despite his track record because he knew how to play corporate politics better than he knew how to manage people. "Thank you for your service." Marcus's tone was neutral, carrying neither gratitude nor contempt. "The new board will be announced within 72 hours. I'm bringing in executives with operational track records from Southwest Alaska Airlines and JetBlue. People who understand that customer loyalty and employee morale aren't opposing objectives." Patricia Vance, the now former CEO, calling in from Atlanta, tried to maintain some dignity in her exit. "I assume my termination is also effective immediately. Michael Torres takes over as interim CEO effective tonight. If he stabilizes the company within 6 months and hits the operational targets we've outlined, the position becomes permanent." Marcus pulled up a document on screen. "You'll receive your severance package per the terms of your contract, Patricia. Unlike Blake Morrison, you didn't commit federal crimes or cause immediate catastrophic damage. You just failed to prevent others from doing so. Different category of failure." The distinction wasn't much comfort, but Patricia nodded anyway. She'd already mentally moved on to whatever came next, probably a consulting position somewhere that valued her resume more than her judgment. Michael Torres joined the call, his square face filling a new video window. Torres had spent 30 years at United Airlines, rising from ramp supervisor to COO through a combination of operational excellence and genuine respect for frontline employees. He'd been forced out during a restructuring 2 years ago and had been consulting ever since, waiting for the right opportunity. This was the right opportunity. First priority. Torres's voice carried the confident authority of someone who'd managed through actual crises rather than just PowerPoint presentations about crisis management. New passenger Bill of Rights. No executive will ever have authority to remove a paying passenger for personal convenience. This gets codified in our DOT filing and company bylaws. Second, crew protection hotline managed from Atlanta headquarters. Any employee can report abuse anonymously without fear of retaliation. Third, mandatory bias and de-escalation training for all executives conducted by the Cornell University School of Industrial and Labor Relations. If you can't treat people with basic dignity, you don't belong in leadership here. Vincent Graham looked like he was watching a revolution happen in real time, which in a sense he was. Michael, this is comprehensive. What's the timeline? Passenger Bill of Rights gets drafted by legal this week, published next week. Hotline goes live in 10 days. Training starts in 30 days, mandatory completion within 90 or termination. Torres wasn't asking permission. He was stating operational reality. We're going to fix the culture that broke, or we're going to replace every person who won't fix with us. Marcus listened to Torres outline the restructuring with the satisfaction of someone who'd found exactly the right person for an impossible job. This was why he'd bought control of the company. Not to run an airline, he had no interest in that, but to install leadership that would treat 12,000 employees like human beings instead of cost centers. One more thing, Vincent, Marcus's voice cut through the planning session. What happens to Blake Morrison legally? Vincent shifted uncomfortably. He's currently being questioned by airport police and FAA investigators at SFO. The FBI has been notified but hasn't formally charged him yet. The civil lawsuit you filed will proceed independently. Good. I want that lawsuit to be very public. $50 million in damages for emotional distress, reputational harm, and tortious interference with business contracts. I don't particularly care if I collect $1 from Blake Morrison personally. I care that every executive in every company sees what happens when you abuse your power. Marcus paused, letting that sink in. This can never happen again. Not to me. Not to anyone. The only way to ensure that is to make the consequences so severe, so public, and so permanent that no rational person would risk it. Vincent nodded slowly. The lawsuit will send that message. Make sure it does. Marcus closed his laptop. Gentlemen, I have a plane to catch. Michael, you have my full support. Vincent, thank you for your years of service. The rest of you, thank you for recognizing when it was time to step aside. This call is adjourned. He ended the Zoom connection and sat back in the leather chair looking out at the San Francisco Bay through the FBO's floor-to-ceiling windows. The sun was starting to set, painting the water in shades of orange and gold. It should have felt like victory. Instead, it just felt like exhaustion mixed with a grim satisfaction that he'd prevented something worse. His phone buzzed with a text from Chloe. Stock closed at $23.40. Analysts calling it a remarkable stabilization given the morning chaos. Bloomberg is running a feature, Skyward Airlines saved by the man they kicked off the plane. You're trending on Twitter. Marcus deleted the message without responding. He didn't want to trend. He wanted to go home, get back to running Titan Core, and never think about Blake Morrison or Skyward Airlines again, except to monitor whether Torres was successfully implementing the reforms. Another text, this one from Vincent. Thank you. I know today was brutal, but you saved 12,000 jobs. That matters. Marcus stared at that message for a longer moment before deleting it too. He hadn't saved those jobs. He'd just prevented them from being destroyed by incompetent leadership. There was a difference even if Vincent couldn't see it. He stood, collected his backpack, and walked out to the tarmac where his Gulfstream waited. The engines were already running, the pilots having filed the return flight plan to Teterboro. Marcus climbed the stairs and settled into the same cream leather seat he'd occupied on the flight out. Chloe appeared from the galley. We're cleared for takeoff in 5 minutes, Mr. Hayden. ETA to Teterboro is 11:47 p.m. Eastern. You'll be home by midnight. Marcus nodded and opened his laptop. Work didn't stop just because he'd spent the day dismantling a corporate executive and restructuring an airline. Titan Core had shipments to track contracts to review logistics problems that needed solving. The world kept moving, and Marcus Hayden intended to be the one moving it rather than being moved by it. The Gulfstream lifted off into the darkening California sky, climbing fast and smooth toward cruise altitude. Below San Francisco glittered like a circuit board millions of lives, intersecting in patterns too complex to fully comprehend. One of those lives belonged to Blake Morrison, currently sitting in an airport police interview room, watching his future dissolve into federal charges and financial ruin. Marcus felt no satisfaction in that, no joy. Just the cold recognition that some lessons could only be taught through consequences, and some people would only learn when everything they valued had been taken away. 6 months later, the transformation of Skyward Airlines was complete enough to measure. The stock had recovered to $41 per share, still below the pre-crash level, but climbing steadily. Customer satisfaction scores had jumped 34%, driven by a combination of improved crew morale and actual accountability for service failures. Employee retention was up 28%, a remarkable swing in an industry where turnover was typically measured in double digits. Michael Torres had been named permanent CEO after hitting every target Marcus had set for him. The passenger Bill of Rights was now published on every ticket confirmation and displayed in every gate area. The Crew Protection Hotline had received 437 calls in 6 months, resulting in 42 terminations of supervisors and managers who'd been abusing their authority in ways large and small. The culture was changing. Slowly, painfully, but changing. Rachel Torres. No relation to Michael, though. They joked about starting a dynasty, sat in her new office at Skyward headquarters in Atlanta, reviewing the latest batch of crew complaints. Her title was now Director of Crew Advocacy, the trial period having ended with such overwhelmingly positive results that the board had fast-tracked her promotion. The office was modest but professional, with windows overlooking the Hartsfield-Jackson runways, where aircraft took off and landed in an endless ballet of precision. On the wall behind her desk hung a framed photograph from the ribbon-cutting ceremony for the new Crew Resource Center. Rachel standing next to Marcus Hayden, while Vincent Graham made a speech about the airline's commitment to employee welfare. Her phone rang. Gate agent from Dallas-Fort Worth, voice shaking, reporting that her supervisor had screamed at her for rebooking a passenger without explicit authorization, even though the rebooking had been necessary to accommodate a medical emergency. Rachel's voice was calm and professional, carrying the authority of someone who'd been terrified into silence once and would never let it happen to someone else. Tell me everything. Names, times, exact words if you remember them. You're protected under federal whistleblower statutes. This will be investigated within 48 hours. And if your supervisor violated our harassment policies, they'll be terminated. You did the right thing calling. She hung up and immediately sent the complaint to Michael Torres's office with a red flag for urgent review. The old Skyward would have buried this. The new Skyward fired people who acted like Blake Morrison. Rachel's personal life had stabilized in ways she'd barely dared to hope for 6 months ago. Her mother's chemotherapy had been successful, the cancer in remission, the medical bills manageable now that Rachel's salary had more than doubled. The Queen's apartment was paid off. She'd even started dating again, something she'd given up on during the 2 years of financial terror when every dollar had been spoken for before she earned it. The business card Marcus Hayden had given her at San Francisco International was framed on her desk, a reminder of how quickly life could change when someone with power chose to use it for something other than self-interest. Blake Morrison's life had changed too, but in precisely the opposite direction. The criminal case had taken 4 months to work through the federal system. Blake had eventually pled guilty to making false statements to federal law enforcement officers under 18 U.S.C. 1001, a charge that carried a maximum of 5 years in prison, but typically resulted in lighter sentences for first-time offenders showing genuine remorse. Blake's lawyer had tried to negotiate that lighter sentence. The prosecutor had presented the video evidence of Blake's behavior on the plane, the financial damage his actions had caused, and a victim impact statement from Marcus Hayden that was clinical in its precision and devastating in its detail. The judge had sentenced Blake to 18 months at FCY Otisville in New York, followed by 2 years of supervised release and a $50,000 fine payable to the Treasury. The Federal Aviation Administration had issued a lifetime ban preventing Blake from working in any aviation-related capacity. The civil lawsuit had settled out of court for $12 million, a judgment that would follow Blake for the rest of his life through wage garnishment since he had no assets left to seize. The divorce from Lauren had finalized while Blake was awaiting sentencing. She'd gotten the Manhattan apartment in the settlement, though it carried a mortgage Blake could no longer help pay. He'd gotten nothing except the legal right to see his adult children, both of whom had stopped returning his calls after the video of his meltdown went viral. Blake was currently 3 months into his sentence at Otisville, a medium security facility that was considered one of the cushier federal prisons, but was still very much a prison. His cell was 8 by 10 feet, shared with a former pharmaceutical executive who'd been convicted of Medicare fraud. His days were structured around counts, meals, work assignments in the prison library, and the particular brand of tedium that came from having absolutely nothing meaningful to do. He'd tried writing an apology letter to Marcus Hayden 3 months into his incarceration. His court-appointed public defender had helped him draft it, hoping it might help with the supervised release phase even though the criminal case was over. The letter had been short and handwritten on prison stationery. "Mr. Hayden, I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. What I did was wrong. I let my ego destroy not just my life but hurt innocent people like Rachel Torres. I'm not asking you to drop the civil judgment. I just want you to know that I understand now what I was too blind to see before, that a person's worth has nothing to do with what they wear or what title they hold. I'm sorry for what I did to you. I'm sorry for the example I set. And I'm sorry it took losing everything for me to finally understand what should have been obvious from the beginning." The letter had been mailed through his lawyer to Titan Core Infrastructure's corporate address. Blake had waited for a response. Any response. Acknowledgement. Forgiveness. Even just confirmation that Marcus had received it and read it. Nothing came back. The letter disappeared into the void, filed somewhere in corporate records, perhaps never even reaching Marcus's desk. Blake didn't know and would never know, which was in its own way the most appropriate response. Blake Morrison had spent his entire career believing that his voice mattered, that his opinions deserved to be heard, that the world owed him attention. Marcus Hayden's silence was the clearest possible message: you don't matter anymore, and your apology changes nothing. Blake had a lot of time to think about that in his 8 by 10 cell, about how he'd spent a decade believing that power came from titles and org charts when actual power came from competence and character, about how he'd mistaken fear for respect and compliance for loyalty, about how he'd destroyed Rachel Torres's sense of safety in her workplace because he'd wanted 3 extra inches of legroom. The mathematics of it were staggering. 60 seconds of ego-driven decision-making, 6 hours of escalating consequences, 6 months of legal proceedings, 18 months of incarceration, lifetime ban from his industry, $12 million in debt that would never be paid off, marriage destroyed, relationship with his children fractured, reputation demolished so thoroughly that a Google search of his name returned only the viral video and articles about his downfall, all because he'd looked at someone in a hoodie and decided they didn't deserve the seat they'd paid for. In the prison library, where Blake spent his work assignment shelving books, he sometimes found himself staring at the business and economics section, remembering when he'd thought he understood how the world worked. Now he understood that he'd understood nothing. He'd been playing a game he thought he'd mastered, while actual masters like Marcus Hayden operated on levels he'd never even perceived. The bitter irony was that Blake had learned the lesson. He genuinely understood now what he'd done wrong and why it had been wrong. But that understanding came 6 months too late to matter, and there was no redemption available for lessons learned after consequences had already destroyed everything. He still had 15 months left to serve. Marcus Hayden stood at the windows of his Tribeca office watching the sun set over Manhattan, the city spread out below him in its evening glory lights beginning to flicker on as day surrendered to night. His laptop was closed on the desk behind him, the day's work completed. Titan Core was thriving, having secured 2 new major contracts in the past month. The Skyward investment had stabilized and would likely return a profit when he divested over the next few years. By any objective measure, Marcus had won. But standing there watching the city, he felt no sense of victory. Just a weary recognition that he'd been forced to destroy a man's life to prove a point about basic human dignity. The fact that Blake Morrison had richly deserved that destruction didn't make it feel any better. It just felt necessary, like amputating a gangrenous limb to save the body. His phone buzzed. A text from Vincent Graham. Board meeting went well. Torres is exceeding projections. Employee satisfaction at 5-year high. You built something good from the wreckage, Marcus. Thank you." Marcus read the message twice before deleting it. He hadn't built something good. He'd just prevented something bad from getting worse. There was a difference, even if the outcome looked the same on a spreadsheet. Another text, this one from Rachel Torres. "Just wanted to let you know we terminated another supervisor today for harassment. The system you created is working. People are finally safe to do their jobs without fear. Thank you for giving me the chance to be part of this." That message Marcus kept. Rachel's gratitude felt earned in a way that Vincent's didn't. She'd been victimized by the system and was now fixing it from the inside. That was meaningful change, not just damage control. Marcus pulled out his phone and opened the Notes app where he'd saved the only piece of Blake Morrison's apology letter that his assistant had forwarded to him. He'd told Chloe to delete it, but she'd saved one paragraph first, thinking Marcus might want to see it eventually. "I understand now what I was too blind to see before, that a person's worth has nothing to do with what they wear or what title they hold." Marcus read those words for the third time since receiving them. The apology didn't change anything. Blake would still serve his sentence, still carry the debt, still live with the consequences of his actions. But at least he'd learned something from the destruction. That was more than most people managed. Marcus deleted the paragraph and closed the Notes app. He had no interest in Blake Morrison's redemption arc. The man had committed a federal crime and destroyed multiple lives in service of his ego. Prison time and financial ruin were the minimum appropriate consequences. But somewhere in the back of Marcus's mind, a small voice wondered if there was something sad about a world where the only way to teach people basic decency was to crush them so thoroughly they had no choice but to learn. Where power had to destroy power because power refused to check itself voluntarily. He shook off the thought. Philosophy was for people with time to waste. Marcus had a company to run and investments to manage. The world didn't stop turning because one arrogant executive had learned a hard lesson about assumptions. His assistant appeared in the doorway. "Mr. Hayden, your car is here. Are you heading home, or would you like me to adjust the schedule?" Marcus checked his watch. 7:30 p.m. Late enough that the worst of the rush hour traffic would have cleared early enough that he could get home to his apartment in Battery Park City and still have time to eat something that didn't come from a delivery app. "I'm heading out. Tomorrow's schedule." 9 a.m. call with the logistics team about the Memphis hub expansion. 11 a.m. meeting with the investment committee regarding the potential acquisition of that warehousing company in Ohio. Lunch with Senator Richardson's chief of staff about the infrastructure bill. 2 p.m. interview with Forbes about Titan Corp's growth trajectory. 4 p.m. check-in with Michael Torres about Skyward's Q3 projections. Marcus nodded. A normal day. No corporate crises, no executives to destroy. Just the regular business of building and managing a company that actually created value rather than extracting it from other people's labor. "That works. See you tomorrow, Chloe." He collected his backpack and took the elevator down to street level where his car waited at the curb. The driver nodded as Marcus slid into the back seat, and the vehicle pulled into Manhattan traffic, navigating the evening flow with practiced efficiency. Marcus pulled out his laptop and opened a new document. Not work. Something else. Something that had been rattling around in his head since the Blake Morrison incident, demanding to be articulated. He began to type. The difference between power and authority is that power is taken while authority is granted. Blake Morrison had power. His title gave him the ability to fire people, to demand compliance, to abuse his position. But he had no authority because authority requires that the people you lead choose to follow you. They followed him out of fear, which meant they weren't following him at all. They were just trying not to get hurt. Real power doesn't need to announce itself. It doesn't need titles or uniforms or expensive suits. It operates through competence, integrity, and the willingness to accept consequences for your decisions. Blake Morrison wore a $10,000 suit and thought that made him powerful. He was actually powerless in every way that mattered, which is why a man in a hoodie destroyed him in 6 hours. The lesson isn't about clothing or appearances. The lesson is that sustainable power comes from being good at what you do and treating people well while doing it. Everything else is just performance art that collapses the moment someone with actual power decides to stop pretending your performance matters. Marcus read over what he'd written, then saved the document and closed the laptop. He wasn't sure what he'd do with those thoughts. Maybe nothing. Maybe turn them into an essay for one of the business publications that kept asking him to write guest pieces. Maybe just keep them as a private reminder to himself about why he'd chosen to live the way he did. The car pulled up to his building in Battery Park City. Marcus thanked the driver and took the elevator to his apartment on the 35th floor. The space was minimalist and functional, expensive in the way that came from quality materials rather than ostentatious display. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the Hudson River where boats drifted past in the darkness. Marcus made himself a simple dinner: grilled chicken, roasted vegetables, quinoa, and ate while reading the latest logistics industry reports on his tablet. After cleaning up, he stood at the windows for a long moment, watching the lights of New Jersey twinkle across the river. He thought about Blake Morrison 3 months into his federal sentence, learning what powerlessness actually felt like. He thought about Rachel Torres finally safe enough in her job to help make other people safe. He thought about the 12,000 Skyward employees who still had jobs because Marcus had been willing to use his actual power to prevent a corporate implosion. And he thought about the simple truth that had driven every decision he'd made since that morning at JFK, that the world didn't owe anyone anything, but people owed each other basic dignity. Blake had forgotten that, or maybe he'd never learned it in the first place. Either way, he knew it now. Marcus pulled out his phone one last time and opened his messages. He scrolled to Rachel's text from earlier and typed a brief response. "Keep doing what you're doing. The work matters." He sent it, then powered down his phone and placed it on the kitchen counter. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new problems to solve, new people to manage. But tonight, Marcus allowed himself to feel something close to satisfaction. Not because he'd destroyed Blake Morrison, but because he'd prevented Blake Morrison from destroying anyone else. That was worth something. Maybe not justice. Justice would have been Blake never having the power to abuse in the first place, but at least accountability. At least consequences. At least one small corner of the world where character mattered more than titles. Marcus turned away from the windows and headed to his bedroom. Sleep came easily, dreamless and deep. He'd done what needed doing, paid the cost that came with it, and ensured the lesson would echo loud enough that maybe, just maybe, the next Blake Morrison would think twice before deciding his comfort was worth another person's dignity. And if they didn't think twice, well, Marcus Hayden would still be there. Quiet, invisible, wearing his hoodie and carrying his battered laptop, ready to remind them that power without character was just noise, and noise could be silenced by someone who understood the difference. The city continued its endless rhythm outside his windows, millions of lives intersecting in patterns too complex to map, some rising, some falling, all of them bound by the same fundamental truth that Blake Morrison had learned too late and Rachel Torres had always known. You don't judge a person by their appearance, you judge them by their actions. And when their actions reveal them to be cruel or callous or willing to hurt others for convenience, you respond with the full measure of consequences they've earned. Not for revenge, not for satisfaction, but because systems that allow cruelty to flourish unchecked will eventually consume everyone, and the only way to break those systems is to make the cost of cruelty higher than anyone is willing to pay. Blake Morrison had paid that cost. The rest of the world had witnessed it. And somewhere in the vast machinery of human behavior, the calculation had shifted just slightly toward decency. It wasn't much, but it was something, and sometimes something was enough.